In this lesson, I'm going to demonstrate the concept of loops in Python. So what are loops, different kinds of loops, how to use them within our coding. So this is where you get a flavor of a very powerful concept, which is loops in Python. So essentially, what is a loop? Typically, when you write code, and we've been doing several examples in previous lessons, statements are executed sequentially. In other words, Python reads the first line of code and executes it, and then goes and reads the next line of code and executes it, and so on. So the first statement in a function is executed first, followed by the second, and so forth. There may be a situation where you need to execute a block of code several number of times. So for instance, let's say you are playing a number game or a number guess game, right? So the first line of code prompts you to enter a number, and then it keeps iterating, in other words, looping around several times until you're able to guess the correct number. So pretty straightforward example. Another situation where you may need to execute a block of code several times would be, for instance, if you're browsing the internet and you enter your username to register on a blog site or something like that. And once you register, you enter your username and password. And if your password is incorrect, what is happening here is it going to loop and continue to ask for the correct password. And until and unless you enter the correct password, you'll not be able to log in. So this is the concept behind a loop. Here's a small scenario of logic of loops. So a loop statement simply allows us to execute a statement or a group of statements multiple times. And you get to define how many times you wish the program to loop. So for instance, here is a simple logic where we have the diamond shape as the decision, which is specified by a condition. So if the condition, for instance, is true, then the conditional code is going to execute and loop around. If the condition is false, on the other hand, then it's going to break or continue to the next line of code. Here's our different types of loops. So for instance, within Python, we can have a while loop. And what that does is simply repeats a statement or a group of statements while a given condition is true. It tests the condition before executing the loop body. A for loop, on the other hand, simply executes a sequence of statements multiple times and abbreviates the code that manages the loop variable. We can also have nested loops. In other words, you can have a loop within a loop. You can also use one or more loops inside any other while, for, or do while loop. So here, I'm going to demonstrate the while and for loops just so that our concepts are pinned down. Here's the difference between for and while loop before I in fact start demonstrating the concepts. Let's take a look at here the basic concept or the difference between the for and while loop. The for loop simply allows you to run through the loop when you know how many times you like to run through the problem, such as, for instance, if the variable I and I is less than 10, you need to specify how many times you want this variable to loop around. And this will continually increase I until the condition returns false. Any number can replace the 10, even a variable. So, in other words, the for loop is where it's a definitive number of times. You tell Python that loop around 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, 500 times, and so on. And finally, it will quit once the condition is no longer being met. And this is best used again for loops that you know how, when they should stop. So again, just think of a for loop as a definitive number of times, the main gist of the for loop. The while loop, on the other hand, allows you greater flexibility in what you put in it and when it will stop, such as, for instance, if you were to do a while I is less than 10, you can also substitute in a Boolean parameter such as true or false for the value of 10, as well as many other types of variables. The main difference or the key difference between the for and while loop is the organization between them. So if you're going to increase to 10, it is a lot cleaner and neater and more readable to use a for statement, because you know that there's a definitive value of 10 and you want the program to loop around 10 times. But on the other hand, if you were to use an existing variable in your program in your loop parameters, it'd be nicer to write a while loop. So in a for loop, you must create a new variable, and that is not true for the while loop. Okay, so if you're using a for loop, then you need to create a new variable and then tell the variable to loop around. Whereas if you use a while loop, you do not need a variable. All right, great. Let's do some examples, right? Let me demonstrate the concept that we talked about of for and while loops. So I'm going to go ahead and click on File and open up our editor here. So click File, New. And this brings up our Python idle editor. I'm going to move this aside so we can see. So let's see if we can do a simple for loop. In order for us to do the for loop, I'm going to, let's say, create a list here, right? Remember, recall from previous lessons. I'm going to simply say something like words and just a bunch of words in a list. And recall list begins with a bracket, right? So I'm going to say something like cat, my dog, and let's see, just making words up here. A window, and let's do one more. I'm going to say I love Python. Okay, so just a simple list that I've created. Next, I'm going to use my for loop. Okay, so I'm going to say the syntax is for, and notice how Python color codes it. It knows automatically as soon as you type for, it's going to turn the color. So I'm going to say for W in words, and my colon. Automatically Python indents it, and I'm simply going to say print W. Okay, so here we have a simple list, and we're going to run a for W in words and print W. So let's simply run this, see what happens. Click on run module, and the source must be saved. I'm going to click OK. It brings up my Windows Explorer. I'm going to navigate to my Python folder. Under data files, Python, and we're going to call it for loop. Click save, and Python is going to execute the code and display the output, which is once again just the cat, dog, window, and I love Python. And of course, since we only have 1, 2, 3, 4 words defined, Python stops after printing the last word, which is I love Python. Of course, I can also add more complexity to my code, or I can build on this existing code. So for instance, if I were to say something like, here's my print, and I want to find out the lengths of these characters within these words. So I can do something like print W and also print the length and then W. Okay. If I run this code again by clicking on run module, click OK to save. And notice this time I get the same output, except I also get the number of words in cat, which is 3, number of words in dog, which is 3, number of words in window, 6, and I love Python has 13 words. Let's do another example. So I'm just going to write a comment. This is another example. All right, great. So next I'm going to say something like primes. Let's do some prime numbers here. Primes equals, one more time, a simple list. Let's say 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, and so on. So I'm just going to say 7. Once my list is defined, I'm going to say for prime. This is a new variable. Remember, when we do the for loop, we need to define a new variable, because first our variable was primes, and this time is prime. And in the previous example, it was words, and it was W as a new variable. So in this instance, for prime in primes colon, And I'm simply going to say print prime. Okay, great. So again, once again, run it. Click run module, click OK, and Python prints the output. Perfect. Let's do a couple more quickly so we get our concepts pinned down. All right, this is yet another example. Okay, here we're going to do something different. I'm going to use the for count, for instance, as opposed to building a list. So I'm going to say something like for count in, and then I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Put a colon. Next, I'm going to say print. Okay, what do I want to print? Let's say I want to print down. Then I'm going to print up. Next, I'm going to say something like print count. I can also print a couple of the lines, or maybe something like print yes times the variable count. Okay, so you get the idea, right? As we're working with the for loop and for in loop. Again, these are definitive number of times I want Python to execute. So if I run this time, click on run module, click OK to save. Notice Python executes the code accordingly. So it prints down up 1 and then down up 2, and of course it multiplies yes times count as it moves along. So the first time it counts twice, and then thrice, 4 times, and then 5 times, because I have 5 numbers here.